Welcome to History vs. Hollywood. This is our companion podcast to the History vs. Hollywood newsletter, where each week we dive into the real history behind some of your favourite films. I am your host / author of the newsletter, Jack Cooper. I'm very much excited to have you here and listening. Word of the rebellion travels from glen to glen. The flames spread, and the Scots rise up to burn out the English. William Wallace, now a leader of a band of freedom-loving men, slips out into the country and lays plans to drive out his enemies. A castle is the first to fall. The nobles who claim ownership over Scotland and the right of the first knight with Scottish wives are smashed into the ground by the hammer of Scottish liberty. With haste now, the rebellion spreads throughout the land. The English, with their steel-clad knights, are no longer invulnerable. Men in great numbers flock to William's cause, and his band grows, allowing him to strike harder against the foe. He is quick with a sword, but quicker with his wits still, and the English are no match for the men of these misty lands. No army has ever stood up to the charge of heavy horse. The English, confident in their victory, will meet the Scots on the field of battle. They do not, however, expect to meet an army captained by a man such as William Wallace. His destiny and Scotland's await at Stirling Bridge. Hello, and welcome back to History vs. Hollywood. This is the second part of a 4-part series on the epic 1995 film Braveheart, directed, produced, and starring Mel Gibson. It tells the tale of William Wallace, the hero of Scottish independence, who fought to free his country from the English at the end of the 13th century. In this second part, we will explore the life of a young and wild William Wallace, his journey from choir boy to cold-blooded killer, and then his transition from outlaw to guerrilla leader. In the film, we are shown a rather dramatic but truncated series of events that send Wallace into outlawry. But in reality, it is a more long-winded and bloody tale that make him the freedom fighter he is to become. So, let's get into it. Last time, we introduced the Wallaces into the story. As a reminder, it's the later 13th century and Edward Longshanks, King of England, had summoned all Scottish nobles to bend the knee at Upsetlington. This was all happening in the wake of the death of Alexander III, who died heirless after being murdered by his horse. Check out last week's episode if you want to hear a little bit more about that. Sir Malcolm Wallace, William's father, and I do say sir because he was an anointed knight, not the down-and-out farmer that Braveheart portrays him to be, ignored the summons from Longshanks and was therefore declared an enemy of England and an outlaw. Malcolm and his eldest son fled north into the wilder parts of Scotland to avoid the immediate execution that was no doubt awaiting them. This left young William alone with his mother and siblings. William grew up in a place called Ellerslie during the late reign of Alexander III. He was raised in a time of peace and was educated in a fairly typical religious manner, similar to many other children of the lower ranks of the nobility. He could certainly read and write, but he was presumably more interested in learning to fight. He likely spent ample time sparring with his older brother, who was, confusingly, also named Malcolm Wallace, using dirks and swords, and perhaps even wielding his enormous claymore that he grew so famed for in later life. Now, if you're unaware, a claymore is a sword that's so large that it usually relies on its sheer weight to cleave through anyone unfortunate enough to face it. William, even as a youth though, was an unusually large chap, and could perhaps have used it with some agility. This is a skill that he would put to use at great length in his short but very violent life, but much more on that later in the episode. By this time, Scotland was essentially under English occupation. Most of the major castles were nominally handed over to King John. In reality though, Edward Longshanks still maintained control. Most of the nobility in Scotland had decided not to rock the boat too much and had accepted their circumstances. The Scots are, and always have been, a proud people. They were growing increasingly resentful of their feudal overlords kowtowing to the English and treating them like chattel. The occupying English forces were behaving, unsurprisingly, much like an occupying army. To say they were overbearing is an exercise in understatement. And due to this, sporadic flare-ups of violence erupted across the country from time to time. And tragically for William, one such incident involved the Outlaw and his father, Sir Malcolm Wallace. Allegedly, in 1291, there was an encounter between Wallace Sr. and a knight called Fenwick, not quite sure how to pronounce it, at a place called Loudon Hill. Due to Malcolm's outlaw status, he was fair game and so could be skewered by any passing knight, and Fenwick decided he'd have a go. Being a Wallace, though, he went down swinging. It is said that Malcolm, during his last stand, was slashed across the back of his legs and hamstrung, and even then, from a kneeling position, managed to kill several Englishmen before being overwhelmed and finished off by Fenwick himself. The news, naturally, made its way to young William eventually, who was left simmering with resentment. One day, he would return to Loudon Hill to seek his revenge, but that was still a few years away yet. In the meantime, things were about to kick up a notch in the life of young William. William would make quite the entrance into the historical scene with his first strike against the English. The year was 1291, not long after his father's death, and by this time William was a man grown, full of charm and laughter, and supposedly, if you'll believe the rumours, standing around 6'5" or even 6'7" tall. The news of his father's death had tempered his naturally joyful nature, but he still exuded a magnetic charisma, a master soul tormented by a deep-seated hatred for the English occupiers. William had been attending the local church school in Dundee, and following Edward Longshanks's influence over the Scottish succession, the castle of Dundee had been handed over to an English baron, who in turn entrusted it to a chap named Selby, a rather unpleasant character by all accounts. Selby's son, aged about 20, behaved exactly as one might expect the son of such a man to behave, especially when he was in charge of an entire city. This particularly disagreeable specimen supposedly spotted Wallace on the streets of Dundee one day and decided he didn't care much for the look of him. The story goes that William was wearing some flashy green clothing, which the junior Selby took offence to for some reason. He approached William, mocked him for his garb, and then seeing that he was armed, demanded that he hand over his dirk. William's response may have been a little over the top, but it is worth remembering that he was simmering with resentment over his father's slaying, and this was a very violent time in history. Supposedly, the encounter with Selby Jr. went something like this. William made to draw his knife and hand it over to the obnoxious whelp. As Selby Jr. reached for it, Wallace lashed out and grabbed him by the collar. Before Selby had time to utter, "What are you doing?" William drove the blade deep into his chest. It killed him instantly. Shocked at the rapid escalation in violence, Selby's companions were slow to intervene, but Wallace was quick. Withdrawing his blade, he fell upon the stunned soldiers and slew 2 more of them in quick succession. Shocked into action, the 2 survivors turned to each other, wide-eyed, and then fled. Wallace eventually emerged from the red fog of his rage, looked around, and realized he'd made a terrible mistake. What had he done? Lucky for him, there was a general uproar and pandemonium of panicking merchants and fishwives screaming and fleeing the scene. Wallace slipped into the crowd with them and fled to his uncle's house. Upon arrival, he encountered his housekeeper and quickly unloaded the details of what had just occurred to her. The housekeeper, cool as a cucumber, didn't miss a beat and calmly ushered him inside. She quickly dressed him in one of her own gowns and set him to work at a distaff and spindle. Crafty idea. Eventually, when the English arrived to search for Wallace, the disguise did the trick, and they left having not spotted him. Presumably, they were accustomed to 6'7" housemaids in Dundee. He remained hidden until nightfall, before making a suitably dramatic escape. Disguised as a pilgrim, he made himself scarce and returned to the land of his uncle in Ayrshire and safety. For the first time, William had embraced violence. It would soon become one of his closest companions, and would eventually serve him as a steadfast guide on his journey to reclaim his land from the English. In the background of William's initial exploits, King John's reign was off to a poor start. Firstly, his rival, Robert Bruce Sr., the notorious troublemaker and other claimant to the Scottish throne, because he was getting on a bit, had promptly handed his claim to the throne over to his much younger son, Robert the Bruce Jr., future King of Scotland. Bruce Jr. then conveniently left for an extended holiday in Europe. This meant he avoided any attempts by Longshanks to make him pay homage. A shrewd move by the Bruces, but an ominous sign for the Balliols. Clearly, their old enemies were still very much in the game. The Bruces' time will come later in this series, but for now, let's focus on the downfall of King John Balliol. Poor old King John gets a pretty bad rap. He gets all the blame for his failed reign. To me, he seems to be a fairly well-intentioned but somewhat weak monarch who was dealt a very difficult hand. His aims were not out of the realm of possibility. He wanted to consolidate his rule, which King wouldn't, keep Scotland independent of England, very noble, and maintain peace within his realm. Nothing wrong with any of those, you might say. The problem with King John was that he just didn't really have the stones to put them into action and face down his troublesome neighbour to the south, Edward Longshanks. Longshanks, which is made of sterner stuff than poor old John. He had made John king and would never let him forget it. Even during his own coronation, John had been forced to swear allegiance to Longshanks. The new Scottish king started out appearing as little more than an English figurehead. As soon as he was crowned, Longshanks immediately began interfering with Scottish legal cases and overruling John's judgments. Whenever John protested, Edward would apply further pressure, and eventually forced him to declare that Edward had the right to judge any Scottish legal case he pleased. Things continued in this manner, slowly chipping away at the new king's credibility, and whenever John disobeyed Edward, he would call him names and label him things like a feudal delinquent and bring him to heel. It was all rather humiliating, really. Things would eventually come to a head in 1293, when Edward Longshanks was called to France to answer to the French king. I wonder why. It was finally time for Edward Longshanks to get a taste of his own medicine. In addition to his kingship of England, Edward Longshanks was also the Duke of Aquitaine. Good for him. But not so good for him. That meant he was a vassal of the French crown. At some point, word went round of a few English seamen causing trouble along the French coast, and Edward was duly summoned by the French king to answer for their crimes. He didn't end up going himself and sent representatives, but the whole thing boiled down into an angry shouting match between England and the French. Ultimately, Edward was forced to relinquish his claim to the French territories, but it wouldn't be long before he was back. And Edward certainly didn't view the fact that he'd been a French vassal as implying that there were any French claims to the English throne. The irony of this is no doubt lost on absolutely no one. Meanwhile, the Scots, feeling the weight of Longshanks' oppressive overlordship and witnessing his trouble brewing with France, saw an opportunity. King John decided to make his move and open secret negotiations with the French. He offered them his support in countering the English, as he knew before long, Edward being Edward, that he would take action and declare war on France. When that time came, the Scots would be there to support the French. John would go ahead and openly rebel against Longshanks and invade England from the north if Edward were to make a move against the French. In return, the French promised assistance to the Scots if they were to be attacked by the English. Sounds like a good deal. Unfortunately for the Scots, when the time came, the French were a lot further away than the English were. Edward eventually got wind of the secret dealings between the French and the Scots, and he moved with his customary speed and brutality. He summoned his army to Newcastle, dispatched his fleet up the coast, and promptly launched an invasion of Scotland. John, now in a blind panic, responded by trying to raise his own forces and get ready to defend his realm. It was, however, too little, too late. War had begun, and the Scots were wholly unprepared. Shortly after hostilities commenced, the English army attacked Berwick, Scotland's thriving trade hub. Due to its inadequate defences, the English swiftly breached the stockade, with Edward reportedly leading the cavalry himself. A rumour had spread about some overborder raids committed in England by the Scots, and apparently there had been a massacre of the locals. With this fresh in their minds, once the English got into city, they put Berwick to the sword. For 3 days, anarchy reigned, as English soldiers looted, raped, burned, and committed countless atrocities. It is estimated that between 17,000 and 20,000 people perished in the assault. This horrific event would remain firmly lodged in the Scottish collective consciousness. The English gave no quarter, and so should expect none in return. A few days after the sacking of Berwick, the English army set out once more into the wilds of Scotland, and it wasn't long before they encountered the main Scottish army. Battle was duly joined, and the Scots, seemingly overzealous, perhaps due to the horrific news coming out of Berwick, charged headlong at the English lines. Longshanks's battle-hardened veterans absorbed the charge, rallied, and then set about decimating the Scottish troops. The Scottish forces were utterly routed, and with this defeat, Scottish resistance crumbled. King John swiftly recognised the error of his ways and wrote to Edward. He confessed his mistake in supporting the French and acknowledged Edward as his liege lord. He then formally surrendered his kingdom to Longshanks, and in July of that year faced a final humiliation. He was forced to appear before Edward, dressed in the white clothing of a penitent and carrying a white wand, for reasons unknown, perhaps because Edward wanted to embarrass him further. Edward then tore away John's formal seal of kingship, earning him the enduring nickname Tomb Tabard, meaning empty coat. Poor old King John then spent the next 3 years of his life rotting away in the Tower of London, for he was eventually released into exile at the Pope's request. He would eventually return to Scotland and to his family estates to fade into irrelevance, whilst the banner of Scottish independence was taken up by his nemesis, the Bruces. Edward had no intention of installing another figurehead in Scotland, given the trouble he'd gone through to remove this first one. He had himself symbolically crowned on the Stone of Destiny before having it removed and sent to Westminster Abbey, where it remains beneath the coronation chair to this day. It would be centuries before another Scottish king would sit upon the Stone of Destiny, when James VI of Scotland succeeded to the English throne in 1603. With winter approaching, the English army made its way home. Scotland had been brought to heel, and Edward Longshanks had earned the nickname the Hammer of the Scots. He returned south with his army, believing it was a job well done. However, William Wallace, the Hammer of the English, had other plans. And perhaps, on that note, this is a good place to pause for a short break. Join us in the second half as we return to William Wallace's story as he transitions from outlaw to guerrilla rebel leader. See you in a moment. You might think that we're heading to an ad break now, but that's actually not the case. The intention with History vs. Hollywood is to keep it ad-free and completely supporter-driven. If you'd like to support the show, the best way you can do so is subscribe, if you're already a subscriber, by upgrading your subscription, or if you're not quite ready for that sort of commitment, you can go ahead and buy us a coffee. All of the details of how to do so can be found in our newsletter. If you're reading this on Substack, well, it's just below. Or if you listen to somewhere else, perhaps on Spotify, Apple, or on YouTube podcasts, well, you can find the link to our newsletter in the show notes. Thank you so much for all of your support so far. All of the money goes towards paying our artists, contributors, and allowing us to focus on this show and give it the attention it deserves. Thank you so much again, and now back to the show. Hello and welcome back. Let's return to the story of William Wallace now, shall we? After his escape from Dundee, William attempted to return to anonymity. This wasn't to be, however. It all kicked off again on a lovely spring day when Wallace was out fishing. Supposedly, William was whiling away the day trout fishing and doing rather well at it. By the afternoon, he had a substantial catch. So substantial, in fact, that it had caught the eye of a passing squad of English soldiers. They rowed down to the riverside and demanded that he hand over his catch. Wallace politely offered them half, believing it to be a fair exchange in return for being left in peace. The English saw it differently and dismounted to take the lot. Wallace, by now, was quick to anger with the English, and his temper flared. A shouting match soon erupted, and before long, an English soldier drew his blade and threatened Wallace. This was a mistake. Wallace turned his fishing rod on the man and struck him so hard that he knocked the soldier off his feet. Wallace then picked up the soldier's sword and set about dispatching the offender and his companions. In another typical Wallace whirlwind of violence, he quickly dealt with 3 of the soldiers. 2, however, managed to escape. The tale goes that when the fleeing soldiers reported to their commander and explained what had happened, he laughed at them, dismissed their losses, and remarked that their 3 dead comrades weren't worth avenging if they'd all been killed by one man. Sounds like a nice chap. This story may well just be that, a story. And since most of these tales about Wallace come from a fellow called Blind Harry, who wrote them decades, if not centuries later, nevertheless, they certainly are entertaining. So let's just agree to accept them as described, shall we? There are plenty more where that came from too, and due to this incident and several others like it, William Wallace became a known figure and was declared an outlaw. Over the next couple of years, Wallace prowled the Scottish countryside like a vengeful spectre, killing any Englishman he encountered. His actions seemed to place him somewhere between a wandering serial killer and a vigilante, and it would be some time before Wallace channeled his panache for violence towards a clear political cause. But it wasn't all murder. During this period, he supposedly also lived as a sort of rakish outlaw, robbing the rich to aid the poor, and sneaking into towns for secret trysts with local women before slipping away into the night, just ahead of the pursuing English soldiers. Terribly dramatic stuff. I do imagine he was having a rather good time living as a wild man. He never missed an opportunity to burnish his reputation, and he often visited towns where his face was unfamiliar and went about ensuring that it would not be forgotten quickly. On one such occasion, Wallace came across an enormous English soldier charging 4 pence a go for a chance to hit him as hard as you could with a pole he was carrying. Interesting chap. I say bring back that sort of public entertainment. It sounds like a fun day out. Wallace took up the challenge and then proceeded to swiftly beat the soldier to death in front of the crowd. When the guards arrived to apprehend him, he turned on them, killing 5 before making his escape. Classic Wallace. By now, William was a well-known figure in the local scene, the giant who made his business of killing any Englishman that he came across. At this point, though, he was no national hero, or even a rally point for the frustrations of his countrymen. More, he was rather an entertaining tale to tell at the pub. This soon would change. Behaving in such a way, it wouldn't be long before Wallace's luck ran out. When it eventually did, this particular mistake he made would end up almost killing him, but then also solidifying the mythology that surrounded him and forming him into the legend that he would become. It all happened when he was once again involved in a fish-related fuss. One day, when he was on one of his trips into town, Wallace came across an English soldier demanding the fish carried by a local servant. Wallace stepped in and suggested the soldier leave the chap alone. As always seemed to happen when Wallace dealt with the English, the soldier lunged at Wallace with his staff. Again, this was a mistake. Wallace sidestepped the attack and drove his knife into the soldier's chest. Unlike previous occasions, however, this time Wallace would not get away with it. He had not adequately prepared an escape route, and so was quickly surrounded by soldiers, jabbed at with spears, captured, and eventually thrown into jail. In jail, he was held in absolutely awful conditions, so awful in fact that he soon fell gravely ill and eventually slipped into a coma. The English, when they were checking on him, finding him seemingly dead, thought, well, that's a freebie, and so discarded his body in a nearby dung heap. An ignoble end for our hero. Rumours of Wallace's death spread far and wide and eventually reached the ears of a nurse of his from his boyhood. She came and begged for his body from the English, which they begrudgingly granted, and took him home to give him a proper burial. But to her astonishment, she discovered that he was still very much alive. Hooray! She and her daughter nursed him back to health, and I do quite literally mean nursed. Supposedly, the nurse's daughter had a young child recently, and so decided to breastfeed the unconscious Wallace to help him recover. You can understand why they perhaps left that scene out of Braveheart. Can't really imagine anyone being interested in watching Mel Gibson breastfeed. But who knows, each to their own, I guess. Now, during this ordeal, fame reached out and touched Wallace. The same man who'd predicted that Alexander III would be killed by his horse all of that and more in last week's episode, check it out, heard rumours of Wallace's exploits and his miraculous recovery. He declared that Wallace was destined to be the saviour of Scotland, and as this man, known to posterity as Thomas the Rhymer, was a bona fide prophet of his age, it sent Wallace's PR numbers soaring. Wallace eventually made a full recovery, and with this miraculous turn of events, combined with the confidence fueled by his growing legend, he became convinced of his own invincibility. He set out from the care of his old nurse with a renewed drive and focus. His days as a bandit and outlaw were behind him. Wallace knew that small-scale attacks were no longer enough. Determined to meet his destiny, he set his sights on a greater goal. The English would have to be driven out of Scotland. With such lofty ambitions, Wallace knew he could no longer do this alone, and he went about gathering men and resources. Resources were abundant, as the countryside teemed with English soldiers. All Wallace had to do was kill them and take their stuff. Luckily for him, something he excelled at. In this way, he began to amass silver, weaponry, and horses. And with tales of his exploits spreading far and wide, men flocked to him in increasing numbers, hoping to share in the glory. It began with his closest kin, but soon expanded to include many others. Picts, Anglo-Saxons, Danes, Irish, and Kimmerics all rushed to fight alongside the Wallace. He ended up with cousins, nephews, uncles, and school friends flocking to his banner. By now, he was joined by such names as Tom Halliday, a friend from his schooling days, Sir John Graham, who would soon become his second in command, and was even joined by a fellow called Stephen of Ireland. His cause had finally gone international. All these fateful names would etch themselves into history alongside Wallace, and then before long would join him on the memorial plaques. For although their cause was just, the tale of William Wallace does not end pleasantly, I'm afraid, but more on that in a later episode. Wallace's guerrilla band was now truly coming into its own, and so he decided it was time to get a little more ambitious. It had been many years since his father's death, but Wallace had not forgotten. With his merry band, he returned to Loudon Hill, the site where his father had been cut down by the knight Fenwick many years earlier. The knight himself, Fenwick, was expected to pass through the area in the near future and was delivering vital supplies to the English cause, just the sort of supplies that Wallace's fledgling rebellion desperately needed. William decided he would kill two birds with one stone. He would avenge his father, get all the booty he needed to take his gang to the next level. They lay in wait, and when the English force arrived, they outnumbered Wallace's men at least 3-1. But Wallace had righteous anger and surprise on his side. The fight may have gone something like this. As the English marched into the kill zone, Wallace sprung his trap. At his signal, his men released boulders that crashed down into the valley and blocked the English escape route. Before the English knew what was about to hit them, Wallace leapt from his hiding place and drove a spear into the first horseman's mount. The spear shattered under the force of the blow, and the horse fell. Wallace drew his enormous blade and swiftly finished the rider. The Scots roared a battle cry and charged into the English, thrusting spears into the soft underbellies of the armoured horses and dragging their riders down to be finished with dagger and axe. In the chaos of the battle, Fenwick spotted Wallace as the Scotsman towered above his men. He aimed his lance and charged. Wallace turned and faced the charge, but at the last moment he stepped aside and swung his enormous blade, splitting Fenwick's saddle in two. The knight crashed to the ground, and before he could rise, he had his skull split by one of Wallace's enormous comrades. Seeing their commander killed, the English lost heart and tried to surrender. But Wallace was in no mood for mercy, and they slew the English to a man. The hammer of the English had struck his first major blow against the invaders of his homeland. This ambush was the making of Wallace's band. His small force returned from this battle laden with spoils, horses, and confidence that the English heavy cavalry could be defeated under the right circumstances. Armed with this newfound knowledge, Wallace prepared to unleash his fury against the English. But the next chapter of his rebellion, well, that I'm afraid is a story for another time. For now, we'll take a pause on the story of William Wallace and answer a few questions from our listeners. This week, we have a question from Bree Landry. She asked, are there any badass women in Braveheart? Good question. Personally, I can think of a few from this tale already. We've mentioned Wallace's old nurse, who defied the English to rescue him from the dung heap, as well as her daughter who nursed him back to health. Also, there was the house servant who hid him in her own dress after he killed Selby Jr. The problem with both of these is that the names are lost to the historical record as far as I can tell, which is a shame. However, there are a couple of badass women in the wider story of Scottish independence that we can discuss. Firstly, let's talk about Marion Braidfoot, or Bradfoot, or Braidfoot. Let's go with Bradfoot. Marion Bradfoot is often regarded as William Wallace's wife or lover, though her historical existence remains debated. She is the inspiration for Murron, Wallace's wife in the film, and according to tradition was a noble woman from Lanark. Her brutal murder by an English sheriff allegedly sparked Wallace's violent uprising against the English occupation. Wallace supposedly retaliated by killing Heselrig, the sheriff, in his own bed, which launched a series of events that cemented Wallace's role as a Scottish national hero. Her existence does contradict James Mackay's account, the main source that I've been using for this entire series, as he makes no mention of her. But as with all things William Wallace, it's hard to decide just where the truth lies. Now, while there are no confirmed historical records of Marion, her story, likely romanticised by sources such as Blind Harry's poem, became a key part of Wallace's legend. Her death is depicted as the personal motivation that drove Wallace to fight for Scottish freedom, highlighting her symbolic importance to the story, even if the details are not historically verifiable. Another, Isabella Macduff, while not directly linked to Wallace, Isabella Macduff was a historical figure closely linked to the crowning of Robert the Bruce, so a few years after Wallace's death. In 1306, a few years after Wallace's death, Isabella defied the English by placing the crown on Robert the Bruce's head at his coronation, an act of enormous political significance. Isabella's own family supported the English, but her loyalty to the Scots marked her as a rebel. She was eventually captured by the English shortly after the coronation and imprisoned in a cage for 4 years, a brutal punishment meant to dissuade other Scots from defiance. Isabella's courage and sacrifice highlight the critical role women played in the resistance against English rule, standing up for Scotland's independence despite severe personal consequences. So, thank you very much for that, Brie. I wish there was more I could give you on that, but we're almost out of time today. So, just to wrap things up, that's all we have time for. Please join us again next week as we continue the tale of William Wallace. Next time, we'll explore how he transformed from a guerrilla fighter into the commander of Scotland's armies and eventually led them in the legendary Battle of Stirling Bridge. Now, if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, please consider subscribing, like the show, share it with anyone you think might be interested. And again, thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time for another installment of History vs. Hollywood. Thank you for listening to History vs. Hollywood. Your support means the world to me. The best way to help the show or newsletter is to subscribe, share with anyone you think might be interested, and like the episodes / newsletters when they come out. If you have any questions, please feel free to share them in the comments, or you can head to the subscribers discussion thread that I will put up after the show in Substack. There you can engage with myself and other listeners, basically talk all things History vs. Hollywood. If you are a Substack user and you're a fan of our work, perhaps you might consider adding History vs. Hollywood to your recommendations. Word of mouth really is the best friend we have in growing the show. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.